Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
There are two cities mentioned throughout the Bible from Genesis to Revelation that are pitted against each other. One is the city of the King of Kings, the Lord of Heaven, and the other is the city of the Prince of Darkness. That one city is Babylon, the other is Jerusalem. And we can see, for example, in the book of Revelation, the destruction of Babylon and the elevation of Jerusalem. Each has a mystery city. Mystery Babylon, abode of the devil, and the holy city, New Jerusalem, abode of the King of Kings. Gary Simmons is here to discuss with me today's program, Iraq in Prophecy.
And J.R., many people have been asking us to speak on this subject. Naturally enough, the nations of the world are gathered around the ancient land of Mesopotamia. The Euphrates River flows down out of Turkey and across Iraq and right down through the old city of Babylon, which, by the way, was rebuilt, at least in part, by Saddam Hussein. The processional avenue, some of the walls, the quote-unquote throne room of Nebuchadnezzar was built, including a stage, J.R., where they held plays back in the late 80s and going up into, I guess, the mid-90s. Saddam Hussein is putting on plays celebrating the old gods like Baal Marduk and the goddess Ishtar in these various kinds of morality plays, and he's aligning himself politically and philosophically with Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, J.R., he calls himself the new Nebuchadnezzar, which has raised the question, where does modern Iraq fit into biblical prophecy?
And our text is in Isaiah chapter 13 and verse 6. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. And this is the burden of Babylon, says verse 1. Well, Gary, let's talk about the history of Iraq and where the word Iraq comes from, or where the modern nation of Iraq was established by the British. Yes. Many years ago, around the 1920s.
Absolutely, and here's the thing about Iraq. It's not a real country. You may think it's a real country, but actually, in the sense that some of the European nations have been around literally for 1,500 years. Old France, for example, Gaul, for example, some of the provinces of Asia Minor, some of the provinces of the Italian area of ancient Rome have been around literally for centuries. Iraq is not a true country. It was assembled from 3 Ottoman provinces after World War I. And those 3 Ottoman provinces were controlled by the Kurds in the north, the Sunni Muslims around Baghdad in the center, and then down south, the Shiite Muslims. And J.R., all 3 groups hate each other with a vile passion. They had to be held together artificially by finally, by the terrible, brutal dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. Otherwise, they would have been at each other's throats.
Which means when a democracy is established, they will be at each other's throats again.
And they already are, vying to see who's going to control that land. Now, the interesting thing is that in the 1920s, there was a man by the name of T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, who taught the Arabs guerrilla warfare. And this was back in the days of King Faisal and the House of Hussein. And he taught these Arabs how to sabotage British railways and how to basically bring themselves to world attention. About that time, the famous newsman Lowell Thomas with the old movie-tone newsreels was going in and filming all this action, and he found a story. He brought T.E. Lawrence back to London and dressed him up in Arab robes, and J.R., he became the White King. And they kind of mythologized all these Arab brotherhoods, turned them into bigger-than-life figures, and the British then were moved by public opinion to give land to the House of Faisal, the House of Hussein, And those lands that were given out turned out later on to be Syria, Transjordan, the Hejaz, which has later become Saudi Arabia, and finally Iraq, which was forged out of basically desert land that was controlled by the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites.
And Lowell Thomas then made all of these factions over there in the Middle East famous.
Absolutely. I have a quote here from T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. In 1920, when he was working with Faisal, who was a tribal chieftain, not a king at that time, and he said that he pointed Faisal to the Zionist return in Israel. And he prophesied to Faisal, saying that the success of Zionist settlement, quote, will involve inevitably the raising of the present Arab population to their own material level, only a little after themselves in point of time, and the consequences might be of the highest importance for the future of the Arab world. J.R., he was advising King Faisal, there's going to be a lot of money coming into this area, and you need to get part of it for yourself.
And they did.
They did.
And of course, the oil fields of Iraq, of Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia are probably one of the motivating factors for the turmoil in that part of the world. And of course, what we see today going on in Iraq with the dissolution of the regime of Saddam Hussein and the eventual setting up of a pro-Western government will not solve the problems. When we come to Isaiah chapter 13, we find that the ultimate future destruction of Babylon as we know it, or shall we say the city 50 miles south of Baghdad, and all of the other related lands of that area will come in the day of the Lord. Well, that's the 7th millennium, and we are in the opening years of the 7th millennium, so the story has not yet ended. It won't end until, I suppose, Armageddon.
We should read Isaiah 13, 5 and 6. They come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Howl ye, for the day of the Lord is at hand. It shall come as a destruction from the Almighty. The setting here is the day of the Lord, the tribulation period. The shaking of the heavens featured here. And J.R., as we come down to the 19th verse of Isaiah 13, it says, and Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. Shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall the shepherds make their fold there. Fascinating that all the way down through the millennia, since the Babylonian captivity, their overthrow by the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, all the way through the 1st century. Babylon has been inhabited by Arabian encampments and by shepherds. But
so this prophecy has not yet been fulfilled.
Right, that's right.
And it is not going to be fulfilled in the next 2 years, 3 years. What we're looking at is the millennial reign of Christ. During the 1,000-year reign of Christ, Iraq, as we know it today, will become an inhabitable land, or an uninhabitable land. What could cause it to be uninhabitable? Could it possibly be these weapons of mass destruction should utterly destroy the livability of that land?
You know, J.R., in other places in Scripture, we do read of what appears to be the mutual exchange of nuclear weapons, and that's one possible scenario, because what is very true about Babylon, and now I'm talking about the old city that's been partially rebuilt by Saddam Hussein, 50 miles south of Baghdad. Old Babylon is very interesting because it has a king. And the very next chapter of Isaiah, Isaiah 14:4, says, thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. And J.R., the king of Babylon has to be figured. He has to be included in this entire discussion.
Yes, and his name is in verse 12.
It certainly is.
Well, listen to it. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? He's talking about the king of Babylon here. So, when we are looking at Babylon historically, its king is Lucifer. When we are looking at Jerusalem historically, Jesus is its king. And so we have the ultimate tale of two cities here, Gary.
Absolutely.
We have the story between Babylon and Jerusalem.
And JR, the bottom line is, it's no coincidence that the nations of the earth are being drawn as if by a magnet to this spot, the confluence of the Tigris and the Euphrates River just north of the Persian Gulf. This is a hotbed of activity because it has a king, and his name is Lucifer.
To this very day, there is a metaphoric king or a spiritual kingdom, surely must be called Babylon. And we'll tell you more about it when we return in just a moment. The nation of Iraq was actually invented by the British. I saw Winston Churchill's grandson on television the other day, and he credited his grandfather with the invention of, or the setting up of, Iraq, and as well the division of Israel. And you know, it's interesting, Gary, that when the British finally set up Israel, they gave, in 1922, they gave everything west or east of the Jordan River to the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan. And then in the 1940s, they carved out the heartland of Israel, including dividing Jerusalem, and gave it to the Palestinians as well. The interesting thing is they created the Mendelbaum Gate and put the barbed wire down through the middle of Jerusalem and gave the old city of Jerusalem, everything within its ancient walls, including the Temple Mount, to the Palestinians. And this, of course, set up the terrible aftermath and all the problems that Israel has had with the Palestinians ever since.
To back up just a little bit, the way it all started was back on, in 1917 when Dr. Chaim Weizmann, because of his work with the British in World War I, as a chemist, was granted, his people were granted a declaration called the Balfour Declaration. Chaim Weizmann had invented a way to extract acetone from maize and therefore create gun cotton, which was badly needed by British troops. And after the war, Lord Balfour wrote a declaration, November 2, 1917, and basically the declaration was going to give the Jews the land from the Mediterranean across the Jordan into what later became called Transjordan. And JR, here's the interesting thing. The king, or not king, at that time he was not king, the desert chieftains, the house of Faisal, the house of Hussein, actually welcomed the Zionist movement. They believed that, for example, here's a quote from Faisal himself. The Arabs, especially the educated among us, look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. We will wish the Jews a hearty welcome home. We are working together for a revised and reformed Near East, and our two movements will complete one another. And the quote goes on, but that gives you a pretty good idea, doesn't it?
That is absolutely amazing.
It is amazing.
But Lucifer, the king of Babylon, had something else to say about that.
Indeed.
And he has fomented all of this problem against Israel. You see, if the devil can get rid of the Jew, then he can thwart God's plan for the human race.
And JR, here's the fascinating thing. We started this program by looking at Lawrence of Arabia, Lowell Thomas, the British press that popularized the desert chieftains, the sheikhs out there, these glorious people. They wanted to make them kings, and they did. They made them actual kings. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Jordan River, the aliyahs of the faithful, the Jews coming back from all of the world to celebrate the return to Zion. And so you had the simultaneous buildup of Babylon over near the Persian Gulf and Zion, the historical mount of the first and second temples, all happening simultaneously.
And this is not necessarily talking about Mystery Babylon as being rebuilt in Babylon, the city 50 miles south of Baghdad. But it is interesting that this Mystery Babylon, wherever it is, whatever it is, this entity ruled by Lucifer who manifests itself in a coming world government and the tribulation period and the rise of the Antichrist, will probably have something to do with the recreation of the nation. I don't know if they'll call it Iraq, but most likely they will. They won't probably change the name of it. But when we get over to Zechariah chapter 5, Gary, we see this city, or this Mystery Babylon woman, actually being taken back to her own base. Now here Zechariah sees a flying roll, a scroll. And then he sees an ephah. And the angel says, lift up your eyes and see, what is this that goeth forth? That's in verse 5. Verse 6, what is it, he says? The angel says, this is an ephah that goeth forth. This is their resemblance throughout all the earth. And behold, there was lifted up a talent of lead. Goes on to say, this is wickedness. He sees a woman placed inside this vehicle, and a talent of lead closing the mouth of the vehicle. That sounds like a door on the side of the airplane, or whatever, or some kind of a hatch on the side of the UFO, or whatever it is. She is taken back by two women with stork-like wings. Now, if these are angels here, this is the first time angels are referred to as women. But they look like, they must be some kind of, because the stork is an unclean bird, a demonic entity that take this woman back to Shinar. Verse 11 says, to build it in a house in the land of Shinar, it shall be established and set there upon her own base. The word base here refers to foundation. So the original foundation of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon is going to have this woman brought back and established on the foundation of Babylon. I don't know exactly what that means for the city of Baghdad or ancient Babylon or the nation of Iraq today. But it looks like the United Nations may have something to do with the restoration of the political entity. Not necessarily a world capital, but something here is going to tie the ancient Iraq in with the future world government under the Antichrist.
Now, this woman in the ephah is the very symbol of evil. The ephah is, by the way, about the size of a bushel basket. And essentially it is a basket with a cover. And you have it being borne aloft, flown over to the land of Shinar, set on its foundation there. And J.R., to me, this woman has to be the mystery goddess. She first appears as Ishtar. Later we see her in the New Testament in Greece as Diana of the Ephesians, Artemis, the goddess of fertility. She is the personification of evil. And by the way, we have to note, again, at this point, it's very important that when in the 1987 Babylon Festival put on by Saddam Hussein, the central pageant figure was Ishtar on stage. I've seen photos of her doing her dance and her recitation and so forth. And this Ishtar is the woman in the ephah placed on her base in Shinar.
That's incredible, isn't it?
It is.
Now, I've heard it told that the Latin word Madonna is the equivalent of Ishtar in the Babylonian language, meaning Queen of Heaven. And so, wouldn't you know, he had the rock star Madonna to help in the dedication of the old Babylon as it was rebuilt by and celebrated a few years ago.
Now, prophecy. What does prophecy say about Iraq? Well, first of all, we have to remember that we have these two simultaneous developments, city of God, the city of Lucifer, developing side by side. The city of God is going to ultimately bring forth the kingdom, the house of David. The city of Lucifer, I go back to Isaiah 14:9, talking about this king of Babylon. Hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. Now, we talk, J.R., about the coming of Jesus very often, but we don't often talk about the coming of Lucifer. But he's coming too, because there's going to be this fight, this battle in the heavens to see who gets the kingdom. And this verse says, it stirreth up the dead for thee. The dead is the Hebrew word Rephaim, which means the evil, the walking dead. Even the chief ones of the earth, it hath been raised up from their thrones. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. And J.R., those kings of the nations are gathering even as we speak.
We are talking about the coming tribulation period and the future battle of Armageddon as Lucifer and Jesus set everything in battle array, and the big fight comes between heaven and hell, between Jesus and the Antichrist, between God and the devil. It's all coming down, and it could occur within our lifetime. We have now arrived. It's quite possible, so keep your eyes on the Middle East. We'll be back in just a moment.